Hello, hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, guys. Welcome to the Versus Fine Print, where we take a look at work that you have out in the world that's already been published, and we just kind of share some thoughts on it. This is not a feedback session. We're not going to look at edits and things like that. It's more just to kind of give an idea of this is our entry into the poem. It's our first time encountering the poem. So, how are we approaching it? What are the things that stand out to us? What are the things that we're kind of doing logically as we read through the poem? Things we struggle with, things that strike us, and things like that. Again, not really editing. It's more just kind of like getting an idea of a reader approaches your work for the first time. What are some potential thoughts and things like that that could come up? Want to give a quick thank you to Thinkative from over on Threads who sent us this work. This is a published poem of hers. So we're super excited to take a look at that. Now, as we go through the poem too, I really do encourage you to let us know your thoughts too. You know, this is definitely not just one person's opinion. Okay. We would love for you to get involved as well to share your experiences because the more we can do that, the more we can kind of have a conversation about the work, which is something that I think we're really interested in if we're writing poems, reading poems, and things like that. So without further ado, give me a moment. I'm going to share my screen so we can take a look at this. And again, if you look at the video description too, you'll actually be able to see the actual poem, including the journal that is originally was found in, which is great. Give us a moment to load this up. Okay, so this is our work. Let's see if I can actually make this maybe a little bigger. Let's see what this does. Nah, it's a little small. You guys can let me know too if you're having a hard time seeing it, but I can zoom in a bit if I get out of this menu. Okay, so I guess it's always good to kind of start off just reading the work. So this is Uncaged by Esther Rome. And my apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name. You can let me know later. Uncaged. If you were raised, say, in the bleak, airless core of a cage too confined for your bird bones to bloom, if you were fed, say, the same bean crust on clay till your tongue numbed, gave up its vestigial sense, if you escaped, say, to a tall windowed house streaming sunbeams and choked with persimmons and plums, each delicacy would be ash in your mouth, nightly pressed into silks. Still, your cheekbones would bruise against the pressed earth. From your uncoiled crouch, you would see in vast beams still the rust flaking bars. We have a poem. We have a poem. Let me know again, just kind of your initial thoughts on this piece as well. Again, this is Uncaged by Esther Rome. So we're going to be analyzing this for the next 20, 30 minutes or so. And as I go through this, let me know what your thoughts are too. So I like to start kind of just with the title and just kind of things that conjures for us. So title being Uncaged. And I think that just some things to think about with that title, Uncaged. So when we have Uncaged, that makes me think liberation, freedom, no longer being fettered. So on the one sense, there's kind of that positivity to that, right? But then there's also kind of that negative sense as well, because if you were uncaged, then that also kind of implies you had the experience of being caged. So probably some kind of mixed feelings there, some little nuances that we'll need to dig into and explore. Other things by Uncaged. It's hard to know too who's doing the action of doing the uncaging. Is this someone that's managed to free themselves, or is this someone that didn't have that sort of agency and so is relying on someone else to escape, to be uncaged? It's also interesting too. It's not escape, right? It's uncaged. So even though they're uncaged, doesn't even necessarily mean that they've what their own feelings are on that. Okay, so just some quick thoughts on the title. Moving on from there, though, If you were raised, okay, so immediately we're having a separation between the speaker and the you, unless this is a speaker kind of reflecting on themselves. Um, if you were raised, say, we're also starting off with a hypothetical. So this is not what has actually happened. We're just imagining. If you were raised, say, and there's also kind of this like spoken, informal tone, right? With the say at the end. It's kind of like this, not a tag question, not a filler word, but kind of having that. You don't necessarily need it, but it's adding some of that colloquialness to this, right? If you were raised, say, in the bleak, airless core of a cage. Okay, airless core I find to be very interesting because when I think of it, originally I was thinking kind of like a bird cage. Um, and partially maybe because it was just taken by all the bird imagery that appears throughout. Seems in general we're talking about a bird. Um, so the airless kind of got to me because I feel like you look at bird cages and like the air is like moving through them. So the fact that it was airless kind of was unexpected for me. The bleak, not very optimistic outlooks and things like that. I make it make sense to me. Airless core of a cage. Unless it's like airless in the sense of like airless as in like, it's not as wide as like the sky or something like that. Maybe that's what was the intention. Of a core of a cage too confined for your bird bones to bloom. Okay, so we have this sense of blooming, flowers, being able to reach kind of your potential, full potential, things like that. Those are kind of things that I think bloom conjures. Interesting, not just like for your like you to bloom, but for your bird bones, specifically the bones. So almost have this sense of like deformation caused by the cage. So the environment has had a direct impact on this bird, on this you, if the you is even a bird. So the environment that they're in is having a negative impact on them and not allowing them to reach their full form. Sometimes I like to walk around my house with my son. Like he puts his feet on my feet and I hold his hands and we walk around and we're like, we're reaching our final form. I don't know why that came up. But yeah, so not being able to kind of reach your full potential. Um, if you were raised in the bleak, airless core of a cage too confined for your bird bones to bloom. Those are kind of the big things that kind of stand out to me. I should have started actually just giving this the eye test. I always like to kind of start poems just looking at them visually. So we have a poem about caging. This is in a relatively restricted form, right? Um, or we have a poem about uncaging that's in a tight form. 4 line stanza, 4 line stanza, 4 line stanza, lots of quatrains. Line lengths all pretty equal. Your longest line being in the second stanza, lengthwise, till your tum nunged gave up. Interesting enjambment there. And your shortest line being each delicacy, being in that first line. So again, kind of interesting that in a poem that's really focused on uncaging, the we have chosen a form that's pretty restricted, and in fact, we never really stray from that. So that's an interesting decision there to be like, okay, we're going to be talking about uncaging, but really limit the the presentation on paper, which I think is interesting. From there, though, what else can we say? Going back to that first stanza, see if there's anything else. If you were raised in the bleak, airless core of a cage, you can find for your bird bones to bloom. Some nice things going on. I like the consonants. Your consonants with the B sounds, for instance. The bird bones bloom. Bleak, airless core. Got some like E, air, or like the assonance there with the vowels. It's nice. Um, just some nice acoustics going on. Um, were raised, say, again, some of those play on those similar vowel sounds. So acoustically, I think this is doing a lot. That's nice. Okay, still not entirely sure. So I don't know if the speaker's talking to themselves, if they're talking to another person, if they're actually talking to just literally talking to a bird, which is possible. Um, let's go a little further. And as I make this journey across the poem again, I would love to know your thoughts. You'd be like, Jeff, you're wrong. You could be like, no, Jeff, don't do that again. And then, or you could be like, nah, I totally agree. You can be like, yes, that's what is happening. Keep me posted on your own thoughts. And if you're watching this in the future, you can do that in the comments. Um, if you were fed, say, the same bean crust on clay till your tongue numbed, it gave up its vestigial sense. When I see vestigial, it's kind of like things, something like kind of like evolutionary, like leftover, like it's hasn't been able to leave you. If you were fed, say, we're still keeping up that kind of conversational tone. So if you were raised, if you were fed, and again, we don't really have control here. So the first stanza didn't really have any control. So they were raised, they were stuck in this cage. So the you or the bird doesn't really have a whole lot of agency. And then in the second stanza, we're continuing with that. The you still doesn't have any agency. They get fed, but they don't necessarily get to feed themselves. Their tongue numbs, but that's not something they, again, have control over. So again, we're just seeing a speaker without much power. If you were fed, say, the same bean crust on clay. It's interesting with the clay because I don't know how to interpret that. Like, is that like the clay, like the saucer that like maybe the food came on? Is that like the floor? Um, the earth, the same bean crust on clay. So the way I take that is you're just kind of fed the same dish over and over and over again. That's how I interpret that. Till your tongue numbed, gave up its vestigial sense. The vestigial sense, taste? What other vestigial sense could your tongue be giving you? It's kind of the question I have there. Give up its vestigial sense. Other things in the second stanza, the same bean crust. I like the specific. It's hard to talk, guys. Specificity. I did it. I can say it. Specificity. Yeah. I like the specificity of bean crust. It could have just been like seed or something like that, but I like that. It's unexpected. Same bean crust on clay. The other thing that's really nice about that line, in fact, really the first two lines there, is you have a lot of these single syllable words. So the result is you get something that's very punchy. If you were fed, say, the same bean crust on clay, da 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 da, like it's just really punchy, 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 punch, jab, 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 jab. I like that. Till your tongue numbed, gave up its this vestigial sense. It's interesting too. So like we have two stanzas now ending on these dashes, stem dashes. And they each, in some ways, kind of feel unfinished, right? If you were this, we don't really know. We're using conditionals. Like if you did this, if this happened, if this, but we never know the other side of conditional, which is also kind of reiterating a bit of that uncaged sense, right? Because it's kind of leaving things open versus closing things and trapping things. So it's kind of interesting there. Give up its vestigial sense. Other things, same bean crust on clay till your tongue numbed. Logically, I don't know if I follow that. Like eat something so often that your tongue becomes numb and you can't taste anymore. But that doesn't bother me. I think it works fine. Even if I'm not logically sure if I know how that works. I can get it. If you escaped, interesting. If you escaped, say. So this is the first mention of escaping from this. So if you escaped, say, to a tall windowed house. So now we get a different place. In fact, this is kind of the only other place that we've gotten so far is the cage, and now we have another place. We have the house. It's not just a house; it's a tall, windowed house. Kind of ironic too, because when you think of like those traditional bird cages, they're kind of like obviously not as big as a house, but like they're kind of have like these long open spaces. If you think of the traditional ones, so it's almost kind of this mirroring going on of the like a bird cage versus like the house. It's also interesting. It escapes to a house. It doesn't escape to a sky or to a tree or a forest. No, it escapes from a tiny cage to a bigger cage. Streaming sunbeams and choked with persimmons and plums. Again, the acoustics here are very nice with the S sounds, the Z sounds on persimmons and plums. If you escape, say, to a tall windowed house, streaming sunbeams and choked. Really interested that you're painting this very like kind of happy, positive, bright image, right? If you escape, say, to a tall windowed house, streaming sunbeams and choked. It's like, whoa, that took a turn. I wasn't expecting that. With persimmons and plums, and then it's like, okay, well, I guess that sounds not bad, but the choking really stands out, especially because like the choked is very interesting enjambment there. It's a very heavy sound. The streaming sunbeams and choked, like that's a much choppier sound than the streaming sunbeams. And also with that line break, so I'm stuck on the choked for a bit. So I'm literally kind of choked ending that line. So I think that is really doing a lot of work. I was at a workshop with Vivi Francis some time ago, and one of her big things is that hey, every poem needs something strange and it needs something weird. So I think that's kind of lending to some of the weirdness there. It really stands out. If you escape, say, to a tall windowed house, streaming sunbeams and choked. Is this thing true? Some of the work you're giving. So this is allowing house to do the streaming. When it's like you would think the same, the sunbeams, they kind of do that from the sun, right? But in this case, no, it's the house that's streaming the sunbeams. The house that kind of has control over the environment, which I think is an interesting concept. Choked with persimmons and plums. So it's almost so we have this element of nature, but too much nature, right? This nature that's actually choking the place. It's the house that suddenly is becoming ironically, it's the house that's becoming caged in a way with the persimmons and the plums that the bird, if the you as a bird finds. Each delicacies. Okay, so now we're breaking from the pattern. We've had these if you. Interesting enough, it's not the if you stanza that mentions escaped that breaks the pattern. It's the following stanza that breaks the pattern. Because that would probably be too on the nose, right? If this stanza with the escaping broke the pattern, I'd be like, of course that stanza broke the pattern. It escaped. So it's almost like too perfect. So I think that's an interesting choice to break the pattern of the stanza. I think we also mentioned that's also our shortest line. Each delicacy would be ash in your mouth. The poem is this interesting. I don't know if it's an obsession yet, but this interesting kind of connection with taste and things disappearing when they enter your mouth and things like your tongue numbed and gave up its vestigial sense. Each delicacy would be ash in your mouth. So there's a lot of this sense of like taste being something that disgusts in a way or that goes negatively. There's these negative associations with taste. Even though the things themselves are providing sustenance, the same bean crust. Yeah, I mean, you may not want to be fed the same thing over and over again, but it's also the same thing that sustains you. The persimmons and plums, the delicacies, these are delicacies, natural fruits and things, but they would become ash. Nightly pressed into silks. I don't know what's being pressed in the silks. Your cheekbone, I'm guessing. Nightly pressed in the silks, your cheekbone. Still your cheekbone would bruise against the pressed earth. Okay. Light. So it sounds to me like it's almost like saying, hey, like, even those times when you're out of your cage and like you get that nice pillow or something like that, you're still going to be in pain. But I guess I'm a little confused by place. By the nightly pressed into silks, but the cheekbone bruised against the pressed earth. So I'm a little bit confused about how we got from the silks. If I'm in the silks with my cheekbone, why are my cheekbones in the pressed earth? The connection there I get a little bit lost on. But sometimes I'm daft and I just like miss things. That is something that, and again, this is just an initial reading. I read it a couple times very briefly, but not to this level of analysis before. So it certainly could be that I'm just missing something. Um, from your uncoiled crouch, you would see in vast beams. Okay, so beams makes second appearance. We saw that earlier with the sunbeams. So I don't know if the vast beams are referring to more like a metal object, like in a cage or something like that, or if that is referring back to the sunbeams. Just having that repetition makes me think that's referring back to the sunbeams. So it's like the sunbeams are like hitting the bars of the cage again. So are we back in the cage? Did we ever even really escape? Still the rust flaking bars. So the rust flaking bars implying that this cage is old. This is something that's happened for a long time. Also kind of hinted at earlier by the vestigial to a degree. So these concepts were kind of playing, present or desire versus past and reality. From your uncoiled crouch. That doesn't sound bird-like to me. So the bird was crouching. Can birds crouch? Uh, Does anyone know the answer to that? Question is, can birds crouch? Does anyone know? Are birds able to crouch? Just curious. Which again kind of makes me think that this isn't really about a bird. From your uncoiled crouch, you would see in vast beams still the rust flaking bars. Okay, so we still don't have much control. So one of the really interesting things, so a poem's called Uncaged. We don't even know if the you is able to free themselves or if someone does it to them, which is interesting. But then we also have a you that doesn't necessarily have a lot of agency. They were raised, happened to them. Um, they were confined. They didn't choose that. If they were fed, their tongue numbed and gave up its sense. Delicacies become ash. Your cheekbones would bruise. You see something, but again, just because you see it, a lot of times that doesn't mean you control it. It's something that you're just kind of experiencing. The only moment we really have, maybe ironically or not, is the if you escape. That's the one time where we see the you actually be able to have some control over his actions. That's the one time, and very fitting, right, for a poem called Uncaged. That's a good time for that to occur. Um, from your uncoiled crouch. See, I'm a little bit confused too. So, like, uncoiled crouch, so that I imply that means they're not crouching anymore, right? It means that they're. Is that hinting back at earlier? They were really confined, so they weren't able to bloom. But that uncoiled crouch is implying, okay, so finally they can kind of like, finally got some room here. I guess that's kind of what they're seeing. You would see in vast beams, still the rust flaking bars. So I'm a little bit confused here because I'm like, am I back in the cage? But I don't think so. Especially if they're able to uncoil. Because before it sounds like that would have been too difficult because it was too confined. But they're still able to see so they've escaped the cage, but they're still in close proximity to at least enough to still make it visible. So like there's that kind of questioning, like how much How uncaged are they really if they're still, able to see their prison, for lack of a better word right now? So that's interesting. Um, I also like the adjective vast. You would see in vast beams. So just kind of the enormity of the situation. We saw this earlier too with like tall windows. So like I like how the poem is mentioning these things that are kind of opening up and getting bigger once they get outside the cage. I'm trying to think other last things that kind of stand out to you that maybe I missed. Yeah, to me, those are kind of just the quick highlights of things. So again, thank you guys for joining me on this journey through this poem. Again, we're just kind of doing a quick analysis, not providing feedback. We're just kind of giving an idea of what are some things that a first read would encounter from a reader going over your work. This again was from the poet Thinkative on Threads. And if you would like to send us a poem to take a look at for like 20 minutes or so in our fine print series, what you can do is you can find us on Threads. You can see us right. I always get confused. Is with the finger. There it is. Yep. So you can find us over at the Versus Poetry. Tag us with a poem, a link to the publication so that way we can find it. Or if you're looking for feedback, you want your poem to be workshopped, you want to get an idea of how it's working, suggestions, things that are going well, things that are causing confusion, you can also let us know. Send us a poem. Let us know what you're looking for in terms of feedback, and we're happy to do that too. Once again, my name is Jeff. Thanks for spending some time with us here at the Versus Poetry. We will see you guys later. Have a good day. Have a good night. Good afternoon. Take care.